Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the 2024 PK presentation. My name is Thomas Jeffery and I am a teacher at Kyungbuk National University. Today's topic is temporal prepositions, most notably at, on and in. We'll be looking at temporal uptake and how to aid it. This presentation was based off of a published article called Improving Temporal Prepositions in Korean Students and Exploring Gender Differences in Studying Time and Space. It was published in Linguistic Research at the end of 2023, and it explored in detail the differences when studying temporal prepositions in boys and girls. The study took place across 5 years, involving more than 100 students and dozens of English and Korean teachers to try to ascertain the most effective ways to teach the temporal prepositions at, on and in, which are a tricky subject for Korean English language learners. At the school that the study took place at, for many years there appeared to be a significant problem when it came to temporal prepositions. Across all ages and all levels, all students appeared to have significant difficulties when understanding the temporal prepositions at, on and in, and thus the study was undertaken. The problem appeared to reside in the differences between the L1 and L2 languages. Notably, whereas English had 3 different temporal prepositions, at, on and in Korean, the language only has 1, which can be used in any particular order or with any grammatical setup. Thus, somewhat understandably, students who were learning English for the first time, when their base language was Korean, found it incredibly complicated and somewhat overwhelming to try to understand why they had to learn 3 different temporal prepositions and when each one could be appropriately used and in what order. After a pretest had been administered to understand the full nature of the problem, the students were then taught temporal prepositions, clearly using a timeline and a scale showing at, on and in with regards to larger, medium and smaller time preferences, wherein each one could fit. At this point in the study, a second class was also taught. The second class was taught using both spatial and temporal prepositions, using the same temporal words at, on and in. This class was designed with the idea that possibly spatial prepositions might play a role in temporal uptake. This hypothesis was based off of the reading and the literature regarding the subject. A similar timeline was used again, but this time attempting to incorporate spatial concepts. It is important to point out that throughout the entire study, all of the students at all levels fully understood spatial concepts. To put it simply, the research was designed to test whether the spatial prepositions, such as on the table, might aid temporal uptake, such as on Wednesday. This is regardless of the fact that all the students already knew and had complete understanding of spatial prepositions already. The results were quite surprising. The first important thing to point out is that all students improved with an average of 27.85% across all temporal understanding and uptake, regardless of if they were studying spatial and temporal prepositions or just temporal prepositions on their own when using those timelines that have been shown. The next significant finding was that when the data had been separated into male and female cohorts, the boys appeared to benefit significantly from being taught temporal prepositions when spatial prepositions were reinforced beforehand, using the timeline that combined spatial and temporal concepts. When assessing the data, the female cohorts only appeared to improve by about 2% when temporal prepositions were combined with spatial prepositions. However, significantly with the male data, the boys appeared to improve by 11% when spatial prepositions were paired with temporal. While the female data was relatively insignificant, the male data was certainly significant. It showed that for males, temporal prepositions did indeed have a direct relation to spatial prepositions, possibly playing a role in spatial prepositions scaffolding their temporal uptake. So what are some of the key and significant takeaways from this presentation? Firstly, it is important to note that Korean language learners struggle with English temporal prepositions because they do not exist in their native language in the same way. The idea of having three separate temporal prepositions that can be used in a multitude of different situations is very confusing. Secondly, if a teacher or an instructor is to try to teach this as a concept, it is important to try to use a timeline, separating the words at, on, and in into smaller, medium, and larger time sizes to try to familiarize Korean language learners with these ideas. Thirdly, it would be highly advisable that if there are any males in the class, or if the class is being taught at a male school, such as an all-boys school, teaching spatial prepositions in conjunction with temporal prepositions is highly advisable, as it will aid the uptake. Finally, some closing thoughts. While the researcher cannot confidently say that he knows why there is the difference between female and male students when it comes to the spatial and temporal links, he can make some assumptions based off of the research around the topic. One such assumption would be that, put simply, female students are better at understanding and comprehending more abstract notions at the elementary level. While it is a very complicated subject and something that the researcher cannot go into in detail, there is an abundance of literature and research that also touches upon this topic. Hopefully, this presentation has provided you with some insight and in-depth knowledge into the topic of temporal prepositions, especially when it comes to understanding them from the Korean language learner's perspective. Understanding this will help aid Korean learners' uptake with regards to English temporal prepositions, and hopefully aid you in your teaching.